Welcome to Chatsunami. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Chatsunami. I'm Satsunami and joining me today is of course the one, the only, the mature Sandwich Adam. Adam, welcome.
Hello. Good to be back.
And for this episode, you might have read the title and thought, two podcasters probably isn't enough for this topic. So we have brought through a very good friend of ours, the one, the only, you might have heard his voice on the Beer and Chill podcast. It is Craigy C. Craig, welcome back.
Oh, thank you very much. It has been a long time since I've been here, so I'm very excited.
Yeah, when was the last episode?
Wow.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I was gonna say, I did do the Dungeons and Dragons short for you back in November, and apart from that,
Indie games, was it?
yeah, probably something to do with indie games. That seems likely.
Yeah. Oh, Craig talking about indie games. That doesn't sound like you.
Perish the thought.
No. So yeah, speaking of indie games, I'm only kidding. We're not going to be talking solely about indie games, although you are the indie game aficionado.
I was going to say, I do believe that is the only reason I got brought in to talk today was to talk about mature indie games. So I know my place.
You were told that there would be indie games and Sony discussions, something which neither Adam or myself can cover.
Perfect. I guess my Nintendo Switch knowledge won't be needed today, though.
As you can see by the title, today we are going to be talking about quite an interesting subject, that of course being what defines the maturity of a game. So what really makes a game mature? To start it off quite awkwardly, I'm of course going to turn it on Adam, because it is tradition by now. Adam, how would you define a mature game?
All right, I'll take first bite at this apple then. To begin this, I decided to try and see if I could define maturity. I thought maybe that was a good place to start. So for me, maturity kind of equals responsibility and like an understanding, that your actions will have consequences, which is kind of, as you grow up to be an adult, it's kind of the things that you're supposed to focus on. And as you move beyond childhood and, reckless abandon, you have to understand that, your actions are going to have consequences. Looking at that, for me, that's what makes a game mature is having this understanding that, you're responsible for your actions and they're going to have knock-on effects. And I kind of looked at the differences. I think there's kind of two major categories of mature games in my mind. You have ones that have this kind of what I called surface level mature content, which I suppose kind of focus on usually things like violence and sexual content, things like that. And then kind of games with a more mature sensibility, sort of ones that deal with maybe kind of more complex issues, real world issues, but again have this kind of balance of responsibility and consequences, which is something surface level mature content really shies away from. In Mortal Kombat, for instance, there's really no consequences to Sub-Zero ripping Liu Kang's like spine out because Liu Kang will just come back for the next match. While other games, there's a much more kind of cause and effect relationship. So that's the kind of way I approached it. But again, it's a very subjective question, so I'm interested to hear how you both kind of look at this issue.
So I'll move it on to you next, just so I can copy your answer, Craig. How would you define a mature game?
Yeah, what Adam said definitely a good start. And then the other thing I considered was a maturity in terms of expectation of experience, so to speak. So one thing that a lot of games, especially sort of jump to indie games already, but especially indie games like to do is they assume that you've played other games and they assume that you have a history, they assume you're a certain age, and I think there's like a maturity to that. So the obvious examples, things like Undertale, which is an RPG which takes the mick out of other RPGs, but also kind of relies on the fact that you've been playing games for a long time for you to play them, if that makes sense. I think there's a lot of that in gaming. My wife doesn't play a lot of games, so like seeing her having to play new games, you can tell which games rely on this sort of maturity where she will be playing something that has no idea what's going on. I'm like, oh, it's really obvious, it's just that green thing there, or whatever. That's the third element of maturity that I thought of there. But yeah, the other two, like Adam said, you've got 18-rated content, and then you've got actual maturity in terms of story and cause and effect and stuff like that.
And I do agree with just kind of touching something Adam said about the idea of kind of consequence in games. And it is something we're just about to touch on, but it's the idea that kind of as games have evolved, there's obviously been more of an emphasis, not for all games, of course, but for a particular few, there's that idea of incorporating consequences into the game. And it's very interesting. Again, it could be thematically, or it could just be how the game's programmed, how not only the player's going to react to the choices, but like how the game is going to present itself in that way. And obviously, depending on the audience and their target demographic, of course, it would kind of display whether or not the game is going to take, as Adam was saying there, like a mature take on this story that they're going to present, or if it's just going to be very surface level and just say, haha, blow up everything, which is pretty much half of the Call of Duty games, I would say. But yeah, fortunately, this is not going to be a Call of Duty episode, so you can both sigh with relief.
Also, only half of the Call of Duty games?
Okay, 3/4.
Only 3/4?
Look, being nice is one of my New Year's resolutions, okay?
Fair enough.
Yeah, big dummy. Good. Kind of just moving on from that, one of the things that we kind of need to touch on is, I suppose, the change in the gaming landscape. What I mean by that is, of course, you'll both know, being gamers yourselves, is that when gaming started, it was very much focused on really just being a pastime. It was like being this kind of thing that you played for a couple of hours, you thought, oh, that was a fun game of Pong, I don't know, Super Mario, that kind of, or not Super Mario, even before that, like Pac-Man and things. And then as technology kind of developed and got better, there was like a bigger scope for storytelling. Craig, I'm quite curious to hear what you think of this, but would you agree with that the more the gaming landscape has changed, the more this idea of maturity kind of came along with games?
It's a funny one because I think like that maturity comes on quite quickly and leaps and bounds, and then sort of there comes in peaks and valleys. I think, for example, you mentioned like Super Mario. By the time the Super Nintendo rolls around, you've got things like Final Fantasy VI, which its entire plot is to do with like effectively a terrorist winning the fight. That's like the entire plot of Final Fantasy VI is the bad guy wins and takes over the world and destroys half of its spoilers. But
oh man,
oh man, it's a 30-year-old game. And then you also got quite raunchy games as well come out around that time. But obviously it's like pixel art, But you get like quite a lot of like quite gross and quite raunchy games at that time. It's funny, and then like I think when the PS1 starts to come out, things kind of they wiggle round. But we mentioned, we were chatting earlier about Leisure Suit Larry. I mean, I mentioned this on the in our messages earlier, not because that's a game that I want to particularly talk about, but more just because it's an example of like a super early, not early, but like it's like that raunchy 90s game. So you have a lot of stuff like that, Duke Nukem as well, which we'll probably talk about a bit more later. But yeah, in terms of like the story maturity, it comes in leaps and bounds as well. I think they were trying a lot of things on like the PS1 era. You had things like Deus Ex off the top of my head. That was PS1. Final Fantasy VII, not to always mention JRPGs. But really, it's like, for me, the PS2 is not as serious. Someone's going to correct me on that one, like Metal Gear Solid 2 or something. But I think it's not really till like the PS3 era where you get The Last of Us comes out. It's like, for me, that's where like gaming changes. The Last of Us is like a shift for me where it's like, okay, this is now where games are now like, this is a better story than most films are coming out with now. It's actually getting made into a TV show. But there you go. That was kind of like my take on sort of the timeline for it.
I can't believe this is a place I learned that there's going to be a Metal Gear Solid TV show. So thank you for that.
No, I think it's Last of Us TV show.
Oh, Last of Us, sorry. Yeah. Last of Us even.
How dare you get my hopes up there? That's not you knew something I didn't.
I'm sure there's a Metal Gear Solid movie coming out.
Is this
there? Metal Gear Solid movie, yeah, directed by Jordan Voight Roberts with Oscar Isaac.
Nice.
Oh, wow. Okay, I know what we are reviewing next once it comes out.
I was going to say, I don't think it's due out for a long time. But
okay, yeah. Chatsunami is officially going on a hiatus until this film comes out.
I'll give you a chance to play the games, Satsu.
Oh, Jesus, no.
Yes.
You might get a quarter of the way through Metal Gear Solid 5.
Between playing that, the Persona games, watching Citizen Kane, I've got a backlog, Adam. I've got a big backlog.
Wait, one of those things is not like the other. Like Citizen Kane is like 2 hours.
Well, I mean... Yeah, there's not a Citizen Kane game, as far as I know. I did look. So anyway, moving back on to the maturity of games, just to cover my own tracks here, so I don't have to talk about Citizen Kane.
Before we move on, Citizen Kane running time is 1 hour, 59 minutes.
Well, there's no way you'd ever be able to watch that.
No, it's too much.
That's too much.
Nah. I mean, it's no Ben-Hur. Every time we talk about something, Citizen Kane always comes up. But yeah, going to you, Adam, what are your thoughts about the evolution of the gaming landscape in correlation with maturity in games?
Yeah, Craig said lots of really interesting things there as well. One thing I thought about, kind of when gaming started, it kind of felt there was a technological limit on what you could obviously accomplish. So there wasn't really any scope to do any kind of quote unquote mature content through like the 70s and kind of most of the 80s. 80s and sort of into the kind of early 90s. It was interesting to hear about, like you saying, about the kind of switch to the Super Nintendo, and I'm not very well versed in the Final Fantasy games, so it was interesting to hear that kind of take on them, taking a more kind of mature storyline. One thing that I thought, it seemed to be kind of in the 90s, we seemed to get this kind of reaction against, on the surface, was quite a kid-friendly kind of mainstreaming gaming market, when you had things like Doom and Mortal Kombat, Wolfenstein, Duke Nukem all came out, and they seemed very much kind of against the grain and really kind of lent into that sort of, mature ideas, which was really very much surface level, whether it be demons or Nazis or whatever, kind of excessive gore. That really kind of seemed to be the rise of that sort of surface level kind of mature content. And then, yeah, as you say, like especially in the 2010s, it seemed we got games that tried to actually tackle kind of serious issues, especially things like The Last of Us. And that kind of made an interesting comparison almost to the kind of what happened to the comic book market in the 90s, where basically after like titles like Watchmen and stuff, the comic book market became obsessed with trying to be really serious, and that's what everything was kind of geared towards. And it kind of felt that after things like The Last of Us, video gaming kind of fell into that as well, that everybody wanted to try and do that. I mean, the Tomb Raider reboot came about the same time, which went for a really kind of gritty edge to it, like very different from the kind of old ones. So yeah, it did really seem to be that the 2010s was that kind of turning point, as you said.
It almost feels as if it's a question of, like, not if they could, but should they? Isn't it? Or rather, as you both said, the fact that the technology was so, I don't want to say primitive, but it was so early on in like the 80s and 90s, and as it kind of developed, there was that kind of scope. You brought up an interesting point, Adam, and it's especially the case of games like Duke Nukem, which, don't worry, I know you'll get your say on it, but it's that kind of idea of, because a game like Duke Nukem didn't exist, or I suppose like Mortal Kombat and things like that, they were kind of the trailblazers of their genres, so they were just like, yeah, let's do it, and that's what we got. Yeah, without any further ado, because I know, Adam, you're chomping at the bit to get into ripping apart this one, will we just dive right into it?
Let's go for it.
And we will be back right after these messages. Welcome to Shatsunami, a variety podcast that talks about topics from gaming and films to streaming and general interests.
Previously on Chatsunami, we discussed Game of the Decade, Deadly Premonition, the romantic thriller, Birdemic, and listen to us get all sappy as we discuss our top 5 Christmas films.
If that sounds like your cup of tea, then you can find us on Anchor, Spotify, YouTube, and all good podcast apps. As always, stay safe,
stay awesome, and most importantly,
stay hydrated.
We are Beer and Chill Podcast.
Podcast where we review TV shows, games, movies, and whatever else takes our fancy.
So what are you waiting for? If you're a cool kid like us, you're gonna listen to the Beer and Chill Podcast. You can get it anywhere from Spotify all the way to your grandmother's radio. My name is Jan.
And I'm Craigy C.
And we are
Beer and Chill.
One of the main questions of this topic, which I thought about, was what actually constitutes, so what's the difference between a quote-unquote mature game or a game that displays maturity? What is the difference between a good example of that versus a bad example? Craig, I'm going to give it to you first. What would you say is a good versus bad example of a mature game?
I'm going to be a bit of a woken stereotype for this one and go for good and go for the Witcher series. It's like the most obvious answer, I think, when it comes to this kind of thing. Multi-branching storylines, a lot of characters to juggle. It's kind of, I don't want to compare it to Game of Thrones, but in terms of like the number of characters and stuff like that, actions have consequences, and your actions in particular have consequences on the characters around you and how they react to things. I always think that's really powerful. Ages ago on Beat and Chill, Jan had a discussion about the best RPGs of all time. One of them that always comes up in our discussions is Mass Effect 2. Very similar. It's like these games are quite mature, not because it's like an 18-rated game, but because your actions are having direct consequences. The things that you do affect other people, and this makes you stop and think about that. The bad example, I think, though, is when you get the games that are trying to be overly edgy to try compensate. We used to watch a lot of bad movies together. Usually what would happen in the first if it was a bad film where they were trying to overcompensate, they would do like sexual assault or something. That's usually what happens in the opening 2 scenes to establish a story. And you get that a lot in games where it's like you get like ridiculous overgo, but not in like a fun way. I don't know if I'm talking myself in circles here, but like Doom, for example, the reboot of that, it has very fun go where it's like these demons explode and stuff like that. But there was that game that came out, I think it was called, is it Agony? It was called maybe, and it got absolutely panned on Metacritic and all that. And it was just like the edgiest attempt at a game ever made. And I think that kind of thing was very shallow, and you can see right through that. With something like Doom, it uses the go to add to the sort of carnage and chaos of the ridiculousness of the whole situation. You get this other kind of edginess, which doesn't always work as well, I think. So that's my sort of good and bad for that.
Yeah, I'm kind of very much in line with what Craig was saying there. Kind of looking at good examples. Again, I hark back to the games that make you make decisions, make you responsible for it, and then force you to kind of live with those consequences. So I'm gonna stray into Craig's turf here and talk about an indie game and bring up Papers, Please, which for me is, I think, one of the best games to explore this kind of mature content and has such a great mature sensibility, because it's a game that asks you to basically define your own morality and define your own kind of ethical framework and what are you going to do. So for those who don't know, Papers, Please, you play as a border control officer in a fictional communist country, and it's your job to check people's passports, work documents, visas, all things like that, to see if they're allowed entry to the country. And you're given, you get money for every person that you process correctly. Money's docked for people you don't process correctly, and at the end of the day you need to get enough money to pay your rent, feed your family, heat your home and everything like that. So it's a very tense game from the mechanics and everything, but it also adds in all these different things. So people will come to you, and a husband goes through at one point and says he's able to go through, he's like, oh, my wife doesn't have the right documents, but can you just turn a blind eye and let her through? But if you do that, you're going to get docked money. A guard will come up to you at one point and say like, oh, like, I need, I'll give you extra money if you get people detained. So, you can make the decision that even though this person's done nothing wrong, you can throw them over to the guards, you'll get a bit of extra money. There's a resistance group going on who want your help to kind of fight the regime. And there's all these different things, and you have to juggle what you think is right and who you're really, who you're working for and everything. And it really makes you responsible for everything you do and make you really think. And then you have to live with those consequences. And it's just a fantastic game. So for me, that's the one I would hold up as, I think the best example of a mature kind of game. For bad examples, to be honest, there are so many you can pick. Like, it's so difficult to pick, but there are so many. For me, it's games that both kind of use mature issues for shock value. They don't treat them with any kind of respect. So there's a very infamous scene, I think, in GTA 5, which, both of you played GTA 5?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do remember there's a torture scene in that where you play as one of the characters and you have to undertake this torture of the suspected terrorist. And there's no real point to it at all. It's really for shock value, and it's, it's kind of, the point seems to be, oh, isn't torture bad? Oh, but here's some pliers, now pull this guy's tooth out. Oh, isn't this awful? Now go waterboard him. There's no discussion at all. It's just pure shock value. And then there's just those games that are just ultra crass. We've circled around before, but the Duke Nukem series for me is just the ultimate example of this just ultra crassness for crassness' sake, in that way of trying to be cool. And it's, yeah, I don't know. It's just the games can be fun, to play, but honestly, just their attitudes to, especially towards women, it's just despicable, to be honest. And it's that way of trying to wear a mature kind of, a mature coat, but you pull it back and it's just puerile sensibility, and it's just horrible, to be honest. So that's the one I'd hold up as just bad examples of quote unquote mature games.
Out of curiosity, kind of just going from what you were both saying there, because obviously you both have picked like very good games like The Witcher. The Witcher's a fantastic example, by the way, and Papers, Please, where you are given these kind of branching decisions and things. But have either of you ever played a game where on the surface level it looks quite, or rather it presents itself as being mature, and on the surface it looks very immature, but as soon as you kind of go into it, it kind of shows itself as having a bit more maturity?
I've got a couple for that. Undertale, mentioned that already. That's maybe the prime candidate for that, but I think everyone's spoken about that, so I'll talk about something else. There's a great game called Disco Elysium, which is a sort of text-based RPG and stuff, and you can get that on, I think, all the consoles now. And it's not that it presents itself to be immature, but it's advertising and sort of promos you'll see for the game are very much, haha, you're playing this wacky cop who is drunk all the time, and you have to try solve the case before he blacks out. And it's basically got that sort of BoJack Horseman element to it, where it's like, haha, look how wacky this guy is. actually, you should probably be more introspective about how terrible a person you are. It starts off being like quite funny and it's got a bit of joke to it, and then the game quickly sort of takes lots of sharp turns and becomes quite introspective. It's still funny the whole time, but there's a definite, like, I don't want to call it a switch of gears because it never switches gears, but it reveals itself quite slowly to you. I mean, it's maybe one of my favourite games of all time because of that. I'd recommend it, very basic, but yeah, if you watch any of the trailers, it's always quite comical, but it does really get you to sit back and have a think about really what you're up to and how your actions have affected other people. Crazy for a game which is effectively made by a bunch of, I think, like 20 people or something.
Probably for me, it's probably Spec Ops The Line, because on the surface, it appears as basically your kind of bog standard third-person military shooter, and it basically plays like that for basically nearly the first half of the game. There's a kind of interesting story, but there's not really anything that kind of differentiates it. And then you hit a certain point in the game, and it kind of flips, and it becomes this interesting like discussion of violence and war and the nature of killing, and it kind of makes you think about a lot of these things far more than basically I think any shooter that I've certainly played has ever done. So that was a real surprise. Also, as well, Wolfenstein: The New Order has that very much that same kind of surface level, mature, kind of campy fun that the old Wolfenstein games had, but you dig into it and it's really a tale of broken people, in this horrible situation who are just fighting this perpetual war, and it kind of talks about what that does to a person's psyche, and it really comes out of nowhere and it's really surprising. So those are the two games for me that really kind of caught me off guard, and that they didn't look to be particularly, have particularly mature sensibilities, but they actually ended up having quite profound ones.
The only reason I bring this up is I was having a discussion with a friend the other day, and of all things, and you might think I'm crazy for bringing this one up, but we're actually talking about the Gears of War series. Don't get me wrong, like, obviously in the outset, it is just like a big bunch of beefy men who have like chainsaws on their guns and they're gunning down aliens. That is obviously the core part of the gameplay. It's a third-person cover-based shooter. But one of the things that really caught me off guard, I remember the only reason I got into the Gears games was because by chance I picked them up in a game shop pre-owned, and I just thought, okay, I'll give them a go. So I tried the first one. The first one was great. And then I tried the second one and I was blown away. There's a particular moment, so going back to something you said, Craig, I know it's like a very old game, but spoilers, there is a scene in that where one of the characters is of course looking for his wife, and she has been kidnapped by these aliens and things, and you have to go down and rescue her. And without kind of giving too much away, the scene where they reunite is just absolutely, it's one of those moments where for a game that does portray itself as this kind of huge bombastic action shooter game, it's something that really got to me. I kind of thought, oh my god. And there's a scene even before that where you rescue another fellow soldier, and initially the main character throws him a gun and he's like, oh yeah, let's go fight them, and I rolled my eyes initially. I kind of thought, oh great, it's another one of these shooters where the guy just shrugs it off, but then literally 2 seconds later the guy blows his own head off, and it's that kind of idea that there's like maturity kind of interwoven, even though the gameplay might not be as mature or it might not present itself. There's definitely like hidden moment, or not hidden, but you know what I mean, there's kind of those moments within the narrative that you don't really expect out of a game like that you kind of play and you think, oh god, what have I just sat down and played? And it's the same with something like, and I'm wondering if you guys will agree, but do you remember Red Dead Redemption? Not the sequel, but the original one back in the day.
I remember it well.
Yeah, where, don't get me wrong, it's a Rockstar game, so obviously there's going to be the stereotypical Rockstar humour, but towards the end of the game, you both remember how it ends, don't you?
Still brings a tear to my eye.
Yeah, it's that kind of, like, as I said, there's all the kind of silly, crude moments, but throughout the story, there's kind of this underlying theme of almost inevitability and that kind of futility of, despite what he's been doing throughout the game, no matter how, honourable you become throughout the game, you're still going to meet the same ending. And, well, obviously, unless you turn the console off before that. Yeah, it's kind of like a game that, I have to admit, I knew nothing about it when I went in to play it, and obviously by the end of it I was just blown away. You could probably say the same thing about the sequel, but yeah, for me, definitely those were the two kind of like hidden gems, or not gems, but like the hidden mature games, or ones that didn't, as I said, they didn't present themselves as being mature, but you kind of found it the more you played through it. But that kind of brings us on to our next point, and Adam, I'll let you lead off with this one. Do you think the role of the type of genre of the game is important depending on the maturity level?
I think yes and no. No, in the sense that I think any genre can tackle mature content, because I think gaming as like an entertainment medium is uniquely suited to kind of exploring mature issues, because it gives a level of control to the player, which always makes things a bit more impactful. And that's the case in any kind of gaming genre. However, yes, because it's quite clear that some genres really struggle, and I'll narrow in on shooter games here as a genre that I think really struggles with this issue. I think a lot of shooter games don't bother. They will just go for that surface level mature content. Your Dooms, a lot of kind of your early Wolfensteins, Quakes, things like that. There's not really any kind of attempt to have a kind of mature sensibility to it. But then there's games that do try to do it, and for every Spec Ops The Line, there are numerous Call of Duty Modern Warfares, and I'll narrow on this. The Modern Warfare series has tried several times to kind of examine and explore more mature issues. Honestly, I don't think they've ever really done it well. Whether it be Modern Warfare 2's No Russian Mission, or whether it's the kind of the reboots attempt to look at the impact of war on children and aspects like that, they've never been able to land. It's always felt more shock value, than it has felt an actual, true exploration of that. While other games have succeeded in kind of exploring the effects of war. There's one called This War of Mine, which is a survival game, and basically you take control of a group of survivors who are trapped in this kind of war-torn city, and they have to scavenge basically to survive and get by until the end of the war. And that presents you with a lot of different kind of moral issues as well, in that how ruthless are your scavengers going to be in taking from other people you meet around you and stuff, and your survivors can get kind of a lot of emotional baggage that comes with the actions they do and everything. But yeah, so any game genre should be able to, I think, has the ability to tackle mature content, but I think just history has shown that some just really struggle. One thing, Craig's probably more able to speak on this than I am, but it seems to me that the indie gaming sphere has proven more adept at kind of dealing with these and presenting mature sensibilities, and I think AAA gaming sphere has. I don't always think that the AAA industry is comfortable with making players responsible for kind of maybe the more serious actions they undertake.
I feel as if, as well, shooter games are probably the most affected by this, because as you said, like for every Spec Ops The Line or even Gears of War 2, you'll get a shooter game that, even when we were growing up, is it safe to say that the shooter genre was kind of, I don't want to say looked down on, but it was kind of considered as like that demographic for teens and edgy teens?
I definitely think so, but again, I think that's the way they kind of presented themselves. It was very much, the violent, for lack of a better thing, violence is cool. It was very much that. It was the kind of thrill of the combat and everything, and there was no real kind of exploration of the actions and the repercussions of the killing. So in a way they were looked down on, but I think partly it was their own kind of image, because it was that was what they kind of focus on, especially in the kind of 90s and 2000s.
Because I'm just thinking back to an example, and don't worry, Adam, like I know we've talked about Halo over the last couple of episodes, so I won't dwell on this for too long, but there's a particular example that springs to my mind, that of course being Halo ODST. Now, Adam, you might be thinking I'm going crazy right now, but basically in that game, I was actually really shocked. So I played through it, it's your standard, oh, you're a soldier in this space army. I'm being very reductive here, but to kind of cut a long story short, you have to fight through the streets and you have to defeat these aliens and get from point A to B essentially. But something I didn't realise was there's actually a sub-story which coincides with the main narrative of this. And obviously this is kind of a thing that you have to go and hunt for. It almost seems as if it's obviously rewarding you for hunting out like these terminals, and it gives you this very, very, quite possibly one of the darkest in Halo. This really dark story about this woman trying to find her father, getting chased by like corrupt policemen, getting shot at by looters and things. It's very interesting to see how there were kind of more attempts back then. I'm kind of generalizing, but you could see more attempts for there to kind of be like more mature takes on certain series, whether it be Halo, Gears, or even to an extent Call of Duty, which I will admit it seemed to have begun probably around Call of Duty 4, when the first Modern Warfare, they presented it as very, mature, it's the next evolution of warfare, and then it kind of descended into that immaturity sphere. And I think you're totally right. I think maybe it is just like a kind of shifting of, I don't want to say perception, but it's like just the way games are kind of made nowadays, where it's AAA companies are maybe trying to appeal to like a wider audience, so they're not willing to take that chance, whereas maybe indie companies, because they've not got the same restrictions, then they're allowed to kind of express themselves more freely. So speaking of indie games, I'm going to hand it to you, Craig, because I know you're, of course, very well versed in this one.
Yeah, it's a funny one because, especially when you mention genres as well, the indie games recently have been doing a lot of stuff with genres you wouldn't expect them to do it, try and introduce this more maturity as well. So you've got, off the top of my head, Hades came out a couple of years ago, which is a roguelike action game, good old button masher. Like, effectively the AAA equivalent of it is like, I don't know, Devil May Cry or something, maybe the AAA equivalent, which is very not mature in terms of its plot and all that. Well, Hades actually ends up telling a pretty good plot with a lot of like emotion dragged through it, and it won a bunch of Game of the Year awards just purely based on the plot side of it. But it's interesting because I think with the indie games I think you get more indie games that are willing to try push these boundaries. I think a big part of that is because they're not in development as long, so I think indie games are willing to try more risks. But also I think like AAA games are under a lot of scrutiny now with their story, and I think, for example, you look at the backlash that Last of Us 2 got as an example, where it tried to tell a story that, whether you liked it or not, was a bit different from what games usually tell. And I think that was quite interesting what they tried to do with that. It didn't work ultimately, but I think AAA titles, they're obviously going to be risk averse when these famous games get kind of shit on for the story. But yeah, just in terms of the genres and stuff as well, I do think every genre now has a chance. I think Hades proved I think this game's out of like Spiritfarer, which is effectively I don't know what you call that, a lifestyle farming game with an extremely mature story now. There's like Metroidvania games with like mature stories and stuff, so it's like the indie scene's proven that anything can be given a deep story if it wants to. And then you've got Kind Words, then you get something like that, which is almost no game at all, but it's an extremely mature concept, which is very fun. I don't think that it's the end of AAA games trying to do mature storylines. We've got things like Elden Ring's coming out this month, the New Horizon game. Both of them will probably have pretty mature stories, so we'll see where it goes. But yeah, AAA games are always going to be risk averse nowadays.
Part of me thinks that as well. Sometimes if a game goes for like a very mature sensibility, it's not always the most fun to play. And I'll go back to Papers, Please again. Like, I love Papers, Please, but I'm going to be honest, I didn't have any fun playing it because it's heartrending and it's grueling and it's taxing. But, that's kind of what it's trying to be. That's what it's trying to do. That's the thing of having responsibility and having to deal with consequences. While a lot of other games with kind of more surface level mature content are still fun to play. The Doom games are fun, but they're not. There's no kind of real sensibility to them there. So probably wonders as well, for like a AAA market, you're obviously wanting people to enjoy your product and stuff. So maybe that's one reason they kind of shy away as well.
So do you think there's like an importance then to try and find like that sweet spot, that kind of balance between a game that's obviously mature but also fun to play? Because I can totally see what you mean, Adam. It seems as if it's almost as if it can be like one or the other. It's very hard to balance both. I mean, Craig, would you agree that like something like The Witcher could be classed as both fun and mature, or would you say that would lean more towards one or the other side?
I think there's a stress element to it, I think, is what the unfun element of it all is, isn't it? Something like Doom, or another good example I think off the top of my head is Borderlands, where it's like, this is, I'm going to switch my brain off and bash some buttons and murder some enemies, and this is going to be a great time. The other example is I'm playing The Witcher, I'm having a great time, and then all of a sudden I'm getting put with a storyline about this Baron whose unborn son's coming back to life and all this, and it's like, okay, Jesus Christ. Suddenly there's a lot more stressy than I was expecting. And I think there's that level of stress, and I think that there's a fun to it. People watch horror films, which is the same kind of stress. I think, just as another example, these kind of things, you've got games that are like not games at all in terms of the gameplay. You've got things like Telltale Walking Dead game, which is like all stress and no no game, but they're still very enjoyable games. So there's definitely I think it obviously depends on who you are as a person, but I think there's definitely a whole load of enjoyment to be had. And I think ultimately games in general, I think, are pushing this boundary about what is fun for a game and what is an experience. And I think you get a lot more games doing that experience style things. Like Papers, Please is maybe the greatest example of it, where it's like there's very little actual game in there in terms of, you're not exactly running about having a good time. But no, that's probably my take on that. Yeah, I think there's definitely a cross, but there is a lot of stress for these mature games. I think that's part of what makes them mature, is that you feel the responsibility, you feel the stress of it all.
That's sort of the way. It's that way of having something that maybe it's not fun to do at the time, but it's something that you really look back on. And so that's what I've looked back on Papers, Please so much more fondly now than I did when I was playing it, because I'm like, I feel kind of enriched for having gone through that. And, it made me really think a lot about kind of myself and, and everything. So it is that balance to it as well. It's the kind of long-term reward versus maybe the more short-term kind of reward.
You did raise an interesting point there, Craig. Just kind of hopping on one of the words you used there. You said it was more about the experience. As you said, there seems to be more of a over-emphasis on really, like, would you agree there's more an emphasis on what provokes the best reaction? Because obviously the best, like, kind of marketing is word of mouth of people saying, oh, this game's scary, or oh, this game is the best game ever. Because one of the ones I'm thinking is more in terms of the genre of horror games. Let's face it, I feel as if next to shooter games, horror games are probably next in the chopping block for ones that don't really handle their topics very maturely. You've got your Outlast, which is just a gore fest. You've got your Five Nights at Freddy's, which is just, it is for kids. Even though it's a game about kids getting killed, it's still a game that kids will probably gravitate more towards. But what do you think of that, sorry?
That's a great shout, especially because the games that are horror and story driven are quite revered. And I think that maybe shows you how rare they are. Off the top of my head, obviously, like Alan Wake, that game's 10 years old now, maybe more, 15 years old, and people were absolutely bouncing when the remake of that got announced. And then there was the other what's the name of that game? Adam, what was the game that you played at our friend's house with the horror story element to it, and the way characters get killed off?
Oh, Until Dawn.
Yeah, Until Dawn. That's a great example as well. Not saying that's a particularly mature game, but just it leans a lot more on the story element than something like an Outlast, which is just like, here's just a whole bunch of go have fun.
Well, I mean, even thinking back to like some of the playthroughs that Adam and I have done in terms of, you know who I'm going to talk about, Adam, the one, the only Monsieur Cage.
Oh,
So, yes, for anyone who doesn't know, David Cage is the man, the myth, the legend responsible for games like Indigo Prophecy, Heavy Rain, Beyond, Two Souls, and, of course, Detroit Become Human. Those games are very heavily marketed as being these games that is a very mature story and it's all about your choices matter and things. But there is a lot. It's almost, I wouldn't say it's as bad as like Duke Nukem, but I wouldn't say it's too far off in some regards, especially, in regards to things like the way women are treated in the game, in the sense of how there's kind of this thin veil. It's something I said to you guys before we started recording. It's like 3 immature games in a mature trench coat. It's not an actual mature game. It's like all of these things that should be mature, but because they're written by someone who probably doesn't have the best grasp of it. So for example, and this is going into kind of sensitive territory, but when Adam and I played through Detroit Become Human, there is a scene that basically features domestic violence, and it's all within a game that is about robots getting freed and things like that, and it didn't seem like the right place for this to be in. And it's that kind of overstepping of, should a game have these things included? Like not this thing in particular, but should they be pushing themselves to be more mature, or should they be, drawing the line and saying, no, this really isn't necessary. Because again, I told you that, Adam, in our Heavy Rain episode, where in Heavy Rain there's a very famous scene where, or infamous as it were, where a child gets hit by a car, and in the finished game you actually see, you don't see the child getting hit by the car, it kind of cuts away. But when you actually read about it, you learn that David Cage thought that it might be better for there to be an actual scene where the child gets hit and kind of thrown in the air, and it just seems unnecessary. But I mean, that was in the promotion, wasn't it? Not the child getting hit by the car, but the domestic abuse in Detroit.
Yeah, they really pushed that. And I think if there ever was an individual who should not be allowed within 100 feet of mature content, it's David Cage. Just to go back to the domestic violence scene, I think what's so egregious about it for me is two things. Number one, it's used as an event to like move the plot along. That's really all it is. It's so reductive, and it's just one of these shock value things. It's quite insulting really to reduce, something as serious as that to basically a stepping stone for the plot. And then number two, it's also used as a way to judge you, the player, by your reaction to it. And so I just find David Cage is so reductive in the way he tries to tackle issues, which is what really kind of grinds my gears about him and his seeming fascination that he feels he can tackle these sort of issues. So yeah, I don't know. I really, as much as some of the games are fun, like the things he does in them just really make you dislike him and his approach to kind of handling serious issues.
I definitely feel as if that is probably one of the worst examples. The other example, of course, being in, I think it's Beyond Two Souls, where there's another, not really a domestic abuse scene, but more in terms of assault. And it's going back to what you were saying, Craig, when we watch bad films. And don't get me wrong, this wasn't in the first few minutes or anything, but it's one of those scenes that, much like in the bad films we watched, it was in the game, but it was only there to kind of be a plot point, and it doesn't come up again until much later. And I think the worst thing about that particular moment in that game was that the game doesn't kind of hint and say, okay, if you're feeling uncomfortable, you get out the door. It kind of gives you that illusion that, oh, once you're in this level, that's it, you can't walk out the door or go to the bathroom or something. And kind of mirroring what you were saying, Adam, yeah, David Cage shouldn't be allowed to touch this particular area of gaming. But one kind of last thing that I want to touch on, and it's something we have talked about, is the idea of marketing within games. As I kind of said before, that particular scene in Detroit Become Human, for some weird reason, was chosen to be the promotional material. And another example, and I don't know, Adam, if you've seen this or you, Craig, but there was one particular moment in I think it was Dead Space 2, some marketing, and basically it was, they got like, I think the first one they advertised it as, like a typical horror shooter game. That was perfectly fine. But in the sequel, they got like people's mums in a room and they got them to watch like the goriest bits of the game, and then they were like, oh, what do you think of this game? And then they were like, oh, this is disgusting, this is terrible. And literally the tagline was something along the lines of, so gruesome that your mothers don't like it, or something like that. And I think the same can be said for a game like Call of Duty, because like the first Modern Warfare, that was definitely a game where it presented itself as being a lot more serious and down to earth and conventional warfare, and finger wagging of don't violate the Geneva Convention there. But then as soon as the sequel came out, you had the bombastic music, the huge set pieces. Eminem actually sang over the trailer. That's how bad it got. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think of that in terms of marketing, because I don't know if it's different kind of in the indie sphere. Or Craig, is there any like particular games you've seen where either it's a good or bad example of how marketing is portrayed, the maturity?
It's funny, it's something that video games have always struggled with historically, is how do you do marketing? And there's always been that edginess to video game marketing. You think back to like the old pictures in magazines and stuff, and it was all the kids gathered around the Sega Mega Drive and they're all exploding or whatever. And freaking out, and the parents in the background like, ooh, those games suck. Or of course there's I forget the actual name of the game now, but it was John Romero's about to make you his bitch.
Daikatana.
There you go. Just as an example, I mean, that was the late 80s, early 90s, was that? I can't, well, it was 2000. Wow. Just looking up, video games have always struggled with like how to market themselves, and I think we've always been talking about like stealth maturity and through games and different trailers and stuff, and you got things like Borderlands was quite like that when it first came. It's like, oh, look at the Go Fallout is another maybe the example we've not spoke about as much as well. Like the trailers for that were always very like, look at the shooting and look at the war and look at this, and it's like, actually no, this is there's a lot more going on here than what we're showing. But I guess it's hard to advertise these things, and you do end up with a lot of things like Call of Duty making deals with Monster Energy or whatever. It wasn't relentless. I'm not sure what brand they're on, and things like that. And video games have always struggled, especially like 18-rated games. How do you advertise yourself correctly? And even I think on the indie scene, it's difficult always for indie games to advertise. They rely on good reviews and people spreading it by word of mouth. You're never going to get indie game shows that people are absolutely blown away by, unfortunately. Apart from Untitled Goose Game, but that's a different story. But like, I think games have always struggled advertised. I don't think that's going to change, frankly. It's not like films where it's 2 hours of content that you can just distill really easily into 2 minutes. You're talking about something that's huge and players have an influence on it. Yeah, that's kind of all I've got to say on that. I guess it's, even on the indie circuit, you don't get a lot of trailers nowadays. Like, oh, that's not true. You don't get a lot of widespread trailers, so it's difficult to gauge games like that. I do want to give a shout out to Elden Ring, which is out this month as well. In terms of mature games, they did a great thing of like plugging the fact they were working with George R. Martin to trying to get a bit of real world clout. I don't know what you'd call that, but like, by the way, you people that actually like fantasy and books and stuff, we've got one of those authors too. One other thing I will say before sort of on this topic though is video games are getting more accepted in the awards sphere. Back in the PS3 era, Journey won a BAFTA for best soundtrack an indie game, and then there's other tons of games since then have won various awards across different filmmaking, writing, and so on. And that, I think that's a acceptance towards mature gaming as well, and I think that will be something that will hopefully carry on, and that will be almost a secret way of advertising. I think Hades won a really specific award as well, like a Tony or something. I don't know what it was, but it won like a typically film award as well. So these kind of things will help promote that kind of maturity in games, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny just talking about things like Daikatana, because honestly, reading about video game marketing is fascinating, just for like the number of things they've tried, and almost the quote unquote mature marketing techniques are almost more fascinating sometimes than the game's actual mature content. Was it God of War 2 that Sony brought like a dead goat out during the E3 promotional event? I was just reading there about Splinter Cell Conviction hiring an actor to dress as an enemy from the game and take a fake gun into a bar in New Zealand, wave it around, and nearly get shot by the police. If you go look at the old company Acclaim and all their like bizarre marketing strategies, like saying that if people put like an advert for their game on one of their deceased relatives' tombstones, they pay the funeral costs. Like, it's bizarre. It's just the fact, you're totally right, how they've struggled. Games have struggled to market themselves, particularly if it is like a kind of quote unquote maybe more mature game. I think as well, there's been a kind of trend of deceptive marketing about the actual mature content of a game, and I think the most infamous example of this is Dead Island. If anybody remembers, quite a forgettable game, I think, and honestly, one of these kind of small open world kind of zombie games. But the CG trailer for this game kind of had this really like gut wrenching, story of like a father trying to save his child from like the zombie outbreak, and everybody was like, oh my god, like imagine the storytelling of this game, and the game itself turned out to have nothing even close to that kind of mature depth of storytelling. It was all, again, surface level mature content. The first Gears of War, I don't know if you remember this, Satsu, or maybe you remember as well, Craig, but for the first Gears of War game, there was a trailer that had the song Mad World, the one that was made famous in Donnie Darko. And again, it was a pre-rendered trailer, and it was like the main character was kind of running through these deserted like streets, and he was finally seeing like things left behind by people as they escaped from the Locust invasion. And it was like there was no other sound to it apart from the song, and it was this kind of emotional kind of mood to the trailer. But then the first Gears of War game to me is like the Starship Troopers of video games, and it has virtually no plot and absolutely no character development. So it feels like there's a kind of been a deceptive marketing to try and get more buzz about a game by making it seem that it's quite emotionally mature and deep, when actually the fact that the end product is nothing even close to that at all.
Because you could say the same about a game like Halo as well, or Halo 5 to be more precise. I feel as if that is definitely the quintessential deceptive marketing example, especially when it comes to FPS games. The way that when that was brought out, Halo 4, it was kind of brought out to lukewarm acclaim. I think people enjoyed it relatively so, but when the fifth one came out, they advertised it as being like this kind of mystery game, or not mystery, but this particular Spartan was hunting down the Master Chief, and there was this whole whose side are you going to choose, and it was like this very, again, it was kind of deceptively portraying itself as having this maturity of where will your allegiances lie? Will you side with the character you've always loved growing up, or are you going to take on this new character? At the end of the day, it was just another linear pew-pew fest in very scientific terms. Yeah, I do agree with you. Dead Island is definitely a prime example of that, though. Was it Dead Island, and correct me if I'm wrong, but was it Dead Island that had a promotional thing where they had like body parts, and let me emphasize here, fake body parts, but was it fake body parts just scattered across the city and people had to find them?
I think it might have.
True.
I think it might have. Again, I don't know if that's one of these urban myth things, but I think it did. The marketing for that game was bizarre though, because it ranged from, as you say, that to that, like the other extreme was the CGI trailer, and then there's just, if you look at some of the memorabilia they released for the collector's editions, it's very, very quote unquote mature in all the bad ways.
What is that? The bloody torso?
Yeah, that's the busty woman naked torso with no arms and legs.
Or head.
Yeah, or head. Quite the collector's piece for your mantelpiece.
It's kind of a head scratcher because you wouldn't imagine someone putting it beside the like Master Chief helmet or like the thing from Gears of War. I don't quite get, well, sorry, I kind of do. I think it's more the idea of they're just trying to drum up as much controversy as possible to be like, oh, buy our game. Would you say that marketing and by extension that first impression makes or breaks a game in terms of like how people perceive it going in?
To an extent, yeah, I guess it's that way of kind of setting up false expectations. And that was the thing that killed Dead Island, is that, people really expected something very different to the end product. But again, I think that was the marketing. I think was almost doing that to mask the fact that it was a bit of a subpar. But not that it's a bad game, but it's nothing special at the end of the day. So it was almost the marketing was trying to make up for that by all their kind of ridiculous stunts and also their attempts to try and mask the true nature of it.
Wasn't Cyberpunk the same?
Well, yeah, I suppose. And they said it was going to be a finished game.
Yeah, well, never mind mature. We're still waiting for it to be finished. Leaving my cyberpunk bashing aside here, because I feel as if it's been a while, because you got to bash Atari in the last episode, Adam.
The bile's building up for us both. We need to get out.
I know. Craig, is there anything you want to lash out against before we wrap up?
No, I'm actually in quite a good mood today. I don't have I guess it's because I'm not on here every week. I don't have a stockpile of bile. I do want to mention something I'm surprised Aaron didn't bring up. Just way back to one of our earlier questions. Games that are stealthily mature. Sexy Brutal. Go play that.
Good point. No, I totally agree. Yeah, actually, a proper mature game. Go play Sexy Brutal.
I have yet to play that game. Both of you have been telling me for ages to play that. It's on the backlog, as I said, next to Citizen Kane and the Persona series. What a night that's going to be. See, on that note, are there any kind of final points you want to bring up about this topic?
Support indie games. Please go buy some indie games. They're doing lots of cool stuff, and AAA games are going to get more and more cautious about what story they reveal. So this is the best place to get games that are going to push the boundaries, and the boundaries deserve to be pushed, not always by certain people. Like maybe David Cage isn't the first person to be pushing these boundaries, but the boundaries of gaming should be pushed like any art style. So it deserves to be critiqued as art, and it deserves to be presented as art. So yeah, keep pushing those boundaries, because I want to see what happens next.
Yeah, I think I would just say maturity it's a very subjective thing, like what you consider to be a mature game or mature content. But yeah, I would just say maybe look for games that do challenge you to an extent, but also maybe make you take a bit of responsibility. Because I think it is a good, as much as perhaps maybe they're not as fun as other ones, I do think they are important end of the day. So yeah, as Craig says, support indie games. Don't support David Cage. Don't support the Duke Nukem series. Yeah, there we go. That's my top tips for the day.
Can we get that in like a t-shirt or a poster?
David Cage's face and then Duke Nukem together.
Just says no.
Tag team of evil.
I thought you said just all those words, like support this, don't support that, don't support this. Like, my God, how big's this t-shirt?
It's going to be like, one of those t-shirts you see on Instagram where it's like the massive quotes, but they like put it on bit by bit. Yeah.
I am a podcaster who was born in July. Don't mess with me, David Cage. Oh, Duke Nukem. Yeah, yes, an indie game bought me this t-shirt.
So I know what I'm getting for my birthday. But no, I would totally agree with both of those. Just one final quick thing to jump on what you said, Craig, about games getting taken more seriously. I don't know if you saw this in the news recently, and I know this technically isn't maturity, but did you see the thing about the Commonwealth Games for this year? Or I don't know if they're this year, but it's the Commonwealth Games where they're starting to include esports.
Yeah, I think that's one of the. I don't think it's this year. I think it's the next future one, but I'm not sure. Yeah, but either way, yeah, it's pretty incredible.
And it definitely, as you were saying, it definitely shows a kind of shift in perception. Because I remember I was watching it with my family, and all of a sudden, as soon as that popped up, they all looked towards me. Of course, me being the resident gamer of the family, and they were like, "Oh, look at that!" And I had to tearfully look back at them and say, "I'm not nearly good enough to qualify for any type of esports, except for salty ramblings." But is that a category in the Olympics?
I think even if it was, mate, I
would
think
still lose.
I was gonna say, I think you'd be surprised just how salty some. They might get some Star Wars fans in there.
Ah, shit. Or Pokemon fans.
Oh,
Or David Cage fans, even.
or David Cage himself.
Oh, God. The thought of him winning awards. In fact, no, he has won awards. Right, okay, I'm ending the joke. But on that note, thank you both for, coming on the episode and discussing maturity within video games. How very mature of you both. Hey,
We are mature gamers.
that's true. You've got the t-shirt and the poster on your wall to prove it, Adam.
And I have the grey hairs.
Yes. Jesus.
The grey hairs been playing all these mature games.
As always, before we wrap up the episode, Craig, where can these lovely people who are listening at home find your content?
Well, they can find me at Beer and Chill Podcast on all the various social medias. And as well as that, if you want to find me and my ridiculous journey in the world of pro wrestling, which is the other thing I'm known for, you can find me at Martin McAllister on Instagram. Yeah, that's the best places to find me. You might not hear as much of my voice as you used to, but you never know. Also, sometimes I stream on Twitch at Craigy Beyond, but that's a very, very sometimes. And yeah, that's all from me. Thank you for the invite.
No problem at all. It's always great having you on. We should really have you on more often.
It is a lot of fun.
Yeah, we've actually got our next episode planned featuring the yellow demonic Tic Tacs themselves. Clearly Adam's favourite topic, of course.
I've been pushing this for years.
Oh, exactly, yeah.
Pre-Sats and Ali. Let's make a podcast just to discuss Minions, was Adam's original pitch.
I'll talk about Sonic for the rest of the years. Let me do this one.
Oh, I see how it is. Yeah, on that note, trying to run away from that topic as fast as possible. If you want to check out more of the Chatsunami content, you can check us out on Anchor, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, and of course, all good podcast apps. But until then, thank you all so much for listening to this episode. And as always, stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly, stay hydrated.